Holy Gospel according to St. Matthew, the 3rd chapter.
Praise to you, O Lord.
Jesus came from Galilee to John at the Jordan to be baptized by him. John would have prevented him, saying, I need to be baptized by you, and do you come to me? But Jesus answered him, Let it be so now, for it is proper for us in this way to fulfill all righteousness. And then he consented. And when Jesus had been baptized, just as he came up from the water, suddenly the heavens were opened to him, and he saw the Spirit of God descending on him, descending like a dove, and alighting on him. And a voice from heaven said, This is my Son, the beloved, with whom I am well pleased. The Gospel of the Lord.
Praise to you, O Christ.
Please be seated. We all need to hear words of encouragement from time to time, don't we? Whether we are embarking upon a new and exciting endeavor, or struggling in the midst of difficult circumstances, or even licking our wounds after a serious setback or failure, we all need someone to tell us that things will work out, that we will indeed make it through the dark times, or that we will recover and rebound when our best efforts have apparently gone up in flames. In fact, as someone once famously pointed out, a word of encouragement during a failure is worth more than an hour of praise after success. Years ago, more years than I care to acknowledge at this point, I was struggling with the whole idea of going to seminary and becoming a pastor. And so I wrote down the pros and cons of such a decision. That is my list of reasons for and against the idea. But afterwards, there seemed to be just about the same number of reasons in each column. Needless to say, I was still stuck. I just couldn't make a decision. And so at that point, I was earnestly searching for, but hard-pressed to find, a final reason that would break the tie. And it just so happened that right around this time, here at Hope, we were honoring one of our members, a pastor by the name of Gene Butel, who was celebrating the 25th anniversary of his ordination. He was serving on the national church staff at that point, and so he wasn't a parish pastor anymore. And that's why he had his membership here at Hope. Well, he was invited to preach that day, and in his sermon, he talked about his own decision and struggle to accept the call of ordained ministry. I'll never forget how he put it. He said, as I recall, when I couldn't talk myself out of it any longer, then I finally knew that it was a true calling, that it was the right thing for me to do. Those words hit me like a ton of bricks, because that's exactly how I was feeling at that point. For months, you see, with all that list making that I was doing, I had in effect been going through the mental process of talking myself out of going to seminary. Only now I was discovering that it was becoming more and more difficult to do. I didn't make my final decision to become a pastor that day, but I did take his words to heart, however. And several months later, when I could no longer talk myself out of it, I finally felt confident that this was indeed what I was being called to do with my life, and the rest, as they say, is history. My point here is that Gene's words that day in his sermon became words of encouragement for me as I struggled to make that all-important decision about my own life and future. And again, I'm sure that we all have had those moments when someone's words were just the encouragement we needed to carry on or persevere. Throughout history, in fact, there have been many people, especially famous ones, who have spoken powerful words of encouragement that still endure to this very day. Alexander Graham Bell, for instance, the inventor of the telephone, once said, when one door closes, another door opens, but we so often look so long and so regretfully upon the closed door that we do not see the ones which open for us. Famed physicist Albert Einstein encouraged, try not to become a person of success, but rather try to become a person of value. John D. Rockefeller, the great industrialist and philanthropist, urged, don't be afraid to give up the good to go for the great. Then there's an old Japanese proverb which says, fall 7 times, stand up 8. And long ago, Buddha announced the secret of health for both mind and body is not to mourn for the past, not to worry about the future, but to live the present moment wisely and earnestly. Then there's Winston Churchill, who almost single-handedly kept Great Britain fighting against impossible odds during the early days of World War II, who announced, if you're going through hell, keep going. And Robert Schuller, one of the first beady-wise pastors who became famous on TV, once observed, I'd rather attempt to do something great and fail than to attempt to do nothing and succeed. Thomas Jefferson encouraged, do you want to know who you are? Don't ask, act. Action will delineate and define you. And it was Helen Keller who famously observed, character cannot be developed in ease and quiet. Only through experience of trial and suffering can the soul be strengthened, ambition inspired, and success achieved. And finally, it was FDR, Franklin Delano Roosevelt, who led the United States out of the Great Depression and in victory in the Second World War, who made it pretty clear, when you come to the end of your rope, tie a knot and hang on. Words of encouragement. Hopefully we've all heard them. Hopefully we've all shared them as well. The noted preacher and professor of preaching, Fred Craddock, once recalled speaking at Ebenezer Baptist Church, Martin Luther King Jr.'s church, some we're honoring, of course, as I mentioned, next week. It was sometime in the 1980s, and Joe Roberts, Ebenezer's pastor at the time, had invited Craddock to speak. And as the service reached the point where Craddock was scheduled to preach, he moved to the pulpit, he opened up his Bible, was about to read the lesson for the day when Joe Roberts, who was seated up in the chancellery with Craddock and several other associates, all of a sudden began to sing. Just as Craddock was about to say his first word, Roberts started singing. Well, the associates started singing next. And then the musicians went to their instruments, the piano and the organ, the drums, electric guitar, and all the people started singing as well. And there was Craddock standing up there at the pulpit with his Bible, just waiting. And then I suddenly realized, Craddock later wrote, I'm the one up front, I'm the leader of this. So I started clapping my hands and singing. And then everybody stood up and started clapping their hands and singing. And it was marvelous. And then at a certain point, the pastor, Joe Roberts, put his hand out, it got quiet, they sat down, and I started preaching. I could have preached all day, he says. Afterwards, he said to Roberts, that kind of shocked me a little bit. You didn't tell me you were going to do that. And Roberts responded, well, I didn't plan it. Then why did you do it? Asked Craddock. And Roberts said, well, when you stood up there, one of my associates leaned over to me and said, that boy's going to need some help. Well, that day at least, the encouragement that a white preacher in a black church needed was not expressed so much in mere words, but in congregational singing that set the tone, prepared the audience, perhaps settled the nerves of the guest preacher himself. That boy's going to need some help, said the associate. And he received it. He clearly received the encouragement that he needed that day. Well, there was another day long ago, a day when John was baptizing in the Jordan River, when Jesus himself came to be baptized. I need to be baptized by you, argued John, and you come to me. But Jesus answered him, let it be so now, for it is proper in this way to fulfill all righteousness. Only then, we are told, did John consent and baptize Jesus. Now, I could talk to you about this morning about why Jesus intentionally chose to be baptized, about how he was making a powerful statement about his shared humanity and his desire to be with us in every sense of those words, even though he was without sin and therefore didn't need to be baptized. But for our purposes here this morning, I would prefer to focus instead on what happened next. Matthew tells us that just as Jesus was coming back up out of the water after being baptized, suddenly the heavens were opened to him, and he saw the Spirit of God descending like a dove. And a voice from heaven said, this is my Son, the beloved, with whom I am well pleased. Two things to note here that go to the question of whether or not Jesus was the only one to experience this moment and to hear that voice. First, Matthew says that the heavens were opened to him, meaning Jesus, which presumably also means that no one else was privy to this vision. And secondly, Matthew also tells us that he saw the Spirit of God descending like a dove. Again, meaning Jesus himself, which once again precludes anyone else from also seeing what was taking place. In other words, according to Matthew, at least, this was a private moment for Jesus and Jesus alone. And so logically then, the words that followed were also for Jesus and for Jesus alone. Even further, I would argue, these words were clearly intended as words of encouragement for Jesus. Encouraging words from his heavenly Father just as he was about to embark upon his life's mission and ministry. This is my Son, the beloved, with whom I am well pleased. Delmer Chilton, a Lutheran pastor who was an assistant to the bishop when I was down in Georgia, once preached a very helpful and interesting sermon on Jesus' baptism and this very point. Using that same tragic story as his takeoff, Chilton imagines that at the time of Jesus' baptism, just as he was about to embark upon his life's work, the Spirit perhaps turned to the Father in heaven and said pretty much the same thing. That boy is going to need some help. Chilton goes on to write, and the Father thinks about it for a few minutes, looks out over the horizon and into the future, sees the trials and tribulations, sadness and sorrow, great adulation mixed with abject failure and frequent rejection. And the Father nods sadly and says to the Spirit, I believe you're right, that boy is going to need some help. And then a slow smile spread across the Father's face as Chilton, and he said, and guess what, Spirit? You're it. And so it was that as Jesus came up out of that water, the heavens were split open, the Spirit of God came down in the form of a dove and lit on Jesus' shoulder, and a mighty voice boomed from above, this is my Son, the beloved, in whom I am well pleased. And after that the heavens closed, the bird flew off, says Chilton, and there was a faint whisper, there, that ought to do it. This is my Son, the beloved, with whom I am well pleased, was apparently exactly what Jesus needed to hear at that moment. On that day, he was baptized by John in the Jordan, just as he was about to embark on his epic, world-changing mission and ministry. He was going to need some help indeed. And in that moment, he received precisely that. For we cannot even begin to imagine what Jesus went through from that day onward, until his life and his mission and his ministry culminated with his death on the cross. We cannot even begin to imagine the doubts that must have been constantly running through his mind, the frequent difficulties and challenges he had to navigate, the endless temptations he had to resist, and the terrible suffering he ultimately had to endure. Of course, he needed words of encouragement. Jesus wouldn't have been truly human if he didn't, because he wouldn't have been truly human if he didn't have to experience the very same doubts and difficulties, challenges, temptations, and sufferings that we do. He wouldn't and couldn't have been God with us if he hadn't. Now, it was a private moment, I would argue, words of encouragement that at least at this point were intended only for Jesus' ears. But if those words spoken at Jesus' baptism sound strangely familiar to you, remotely familiar to you, well, they shouldn't. Because they were spoken, or at least a close variation of them, were spoken later in Matthew's Gospel in a visionary experience known to us as the Transfiguration. If you remember the story, Jesus and his inner circle of disciples, Peter and James and John, had climbed up a high mountain together where Jesus was transfigured before them. That is, his face shone like the sun and his clothes became dazzling white. And suddenly, you may recall, there appeared with them Moses and Elijah. And just as Peter started making plans to set up some tents for themselves and for their esteemed guests, suddenly a bright cloud overshadowed them, and from the cloud they heard these words. All of them, mind you, heard these words. This is my Son, the beloved, with him I am well pleased. Not with whom, a clear indication that the voice is speaking now to Peter, James, and John as well, not just Jesus. And then the voice from the cloud added, listen to it. Once again, words of encouragement, only now with Jesus' mission and ministry well on its way, and with others now sharing in it with him. Nearly the exact same words were spoken to Peter and James and John as well. Why? Because now they too were facing constant doubts, frequent difficulties and challenges, endless temptations, and the very real prospect of pain and suffering themselves. And so they too needed to hear some words of encouragement. This is my Son, the beloved, with him I am well pleased. Listen to him. And they did. A study was once done by a psychologist named Henry H. Goddard on energy levels in children. And using an instrument called an ergograph, which measures the work capacity of muscles during contraction, he discovered that when tired children are given a word of praise or encouragement, the ergograph showed an immediate upward surge of new energy. But by the same token, when children were criticized and discouraged, the ergograph showed that their physical energy took a sudden nosedive. When you think about it, the very same principle applies to all of us, doesn't it? When any of us is genuinely thanked, praised, and encouraged, we definitely feel much better and re-energized. But when we're criticized or put down or made to feel bad, our energy level certainly falls, and we are de-energized. I still remember how Hall of Fame quarterback Terry Bradshaw of the Pittsburgh Steelers used to say of his coach, Chuck Noll, I just needed him to pat me on the back once in a while, and I would have run through a brick wall for him. But he used to give me a, rear end chewing instead. A large part of me just wished he would have reached out and hugged me one time, but I never got that. Maybe it was one of those kids who wanted his daddy to say, I love you, but I never got that from Coach Noll. The point is, we all need encouragement, words of encouragement that inspire us to hang in there and keep striving. Jesus certainly needed them, as we just saw this morning, and his closest disciples as well. But it doesn't stop there, because the one who was encouraged, Jesus, then went on to encourage others. Indeed, Jesus shared some of the most encouraging words ever spoken, words, again, that also inspire and endure to this very day. A new command I give you. Love one another, he said. As I have loved you, so you must love one another. Do not let your hearts be troubled. Trust in God. Trust also in me. Blessed are the merciful, for they will be shown mercy. So do not worry about tomorrow, he once advised, for tomorrow will bring worries of its own. Today's trouble is enough for today. For everyone who exalts himself will be humbled, and everyone who humbles himself will be exalted. It's not the healthy who need a doctor, but the sick. I've come not to call the righteous, said Jesus, but sinners to repentance. Blessed are the meek, for they will inherit the earth. But strive first for the kingdom of God and his righteousness, and all these things will be given to you as well, he promised. Ask and it will be given you. Search and you will find. Knock and the door will be opened for you. And whoever wishes to be first among you must be slave of all. For the Son of Man came not to be served, but to serve, and to give his life a ransom for many. The thief comes only to steal and kill and destroy. I came that they may have life and have it abundantly, said Jesus. Come to me, all you that are weary and are carrying heavy burdens, and I will give you rest. The disciples were once greatly astounded and said, then who can be saved? But Jesus looked at them and said, for mortals it is impossible, but for God all things are possible. And remember, said Jesus at the close of Matthew's Gospel, I am with you always to the end of the age. Words of encouragement. We all need to hear them. Jesus certainly did, and they made all the difference in his life and in his ministry. But then he went one better. He didn't just receive encouraging words from his Father. He then turned around and shared encouraging words with his followers, with all of us, who also need to be encouraged in the walk of faith. And it's these words of encouragement, Jesus' words of encouragement, that will help us make it through this day and every day. Amen.